All right. So good morning again. Ian Christensen with Secure World Foundation. Welcome to the first of 3 sessions over the next 3 days in the SSA Policy Forum. We are here in this session to talk about sustainable operations in the space environment, the role of orbital carrying capacity, and other tools. So in General Garant's remarks just now earlier, he very aptly described the increasing complexity of the space environment, including a number of new actors, new applications, new and increasing debris generation events, and the role of large constellations in this environment. We were also reminded during the cultural invocation at the beginning of our morning of the importance of environmental stewardship and responsibility. So I think our panel over the next hour or so is going to try and look at both of those themes and try to weave them together a little bit. In this panel, we're going to discuss the emerging set of tools, operational experience, and research that can help us to manage and develop sustainable operations in this complex domain. Tools such as orbital carrying capacity assessment, tools such as environmental thresholds, tools such as improved collision avoidance practices, and operational experience that operators have in reducing the footprint of their own operations. Our panel includes a satellite operator, so Eric Babcock, who is the director of Starlink Guidance, Navigation, and Control at SpaceX. It includes a commercial SSA provider, Audrey Schaefer, who's the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Slingshot Aerospace. It includes 2 experts involved in modeling efforts around the space environment, Professor Richard Linares, who is an associate professor within the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT, and Andrea Mucciaccia. I'm sorry, Andrea, I think I got that somewhat close, but I'll do better, who is a PhD student within the Compass Group at the Politecnico di Milano in Italy. And then we have a government space agency, Andrew Ratcliffe, who is the chief engineer at the United Kingdom Space Agency. So I think we have a good mix on this panel to look at things from an operational perspective, to look at things from a modeling perspective, and to look at things from a policy and governance standpoint. So this is the policy forum. The overall question that we want to look at in this panel is, what is the potential need for approaching management of the space environment in a more holistic manner? What is the need for that, and what tools do we have for that? So the way this will work over the next 57.5 minutes is I've got a few pre-planned questions. We'll go through an initial round of discussion with the panelists here, and then as we get towards the end, we'll open it back up for Q&A, so do please submit your questions through the AMOS conference app. And with that, I'm going to turn to the first question, and I will let Audrey get us going as I move from the podium to the panel stage there. So Audrey, Slingshot Aerospace maintains a range of data on satellite deployments and operations and the state of the space environment. What does this tell us about the current state of complexity, risk, and safety in LEO in particular? And what's your view on, do we need more tools to improve our management of that? Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. And as the first panelist, let me just say on behalf of all of us, thank you, Ian, for the invitation to participate. Thank you, Sandy, and the whole Maui Economic Development Board for the fantastic organization of the conference every year. And thank you also to Kahu for the beautiful cultural invocation this morning, which I thought was an excellent reminder of how privileged we are to have this conference in this special place, as well as the reason that we care about space domain awareness is because of the benefits that our space activities bring back to us right here on Earth. But to your question, Ian, so in your question, you alluded to something called SSA data, which is a Slingshot product. It's a database where we curate open source information on every object that has ever launched into space since the beginning of the space age. And so it's a really rich database. And in anticipation of this panel, I queried our database to just pull some basic facts about how the numbers of objects in space have changed over time. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to have to read from the notes because I don't have all the numbers memorized. But in 2009, which was the first year I looked at, because that was the year of the Iridium Cosmos collision, there were just under 1,000 active satellites in all of space, of which about 400 of them were in low Earth orbit. Fast forward 5 years, 2014, which I think was the first year I came to AMOS, there were 1,200 active satellites in all of space, and about half of them, 600, were in low Earth orbit. 5 years later, 2019, the total number was 2,000, and the number in LEO was 1,300. Now in 2024, there are over 10,000 active satellites in all of space, and 9,500 of them are in low Earth orbit. And by the way, about 8,200 of those are commercial satellites, and about half of those satellites are roughly about 500 to 600 kilometers altitude. So that's a pretty dramatic change in the last 15 years, just purely in terms of numbers of objects. The other interesting statistic I wanted to offer, and this one's actually in a report that Slingshot published earlier this year on the state of satellite developments and orbital deployments. It's not low Earth orbit, it's up in GEO, but it's the average separation distance between objects in GEO. 10 years ago in 2014, that average distance was 350 kilometers. Now, 10 years later, it's 250 kilometers. So in addition to just the sheer number of objects rising, we're also seeing closer operations, more dynamic operations, more complex operations that I think are really very dramatically changing just the context in which all of these space activities happen.
Thank you, Audrey. Yeah, so those numbers almost speak for themselves, right? We can't look at that and say that everything is static, right? It's certainly not. So, Andy, I want to come to you. From the perspective of the United Kingdom Space Agency, how do you view the trends which Audrey was just describing?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And before I start, I'd just like to follow Audrey. Obviously, AMOS has a rich history, so it's very much a privilege to be here and talk to you today. So to address this trends, the UK recognises that space is becoming increasingly congested and contested, as we heard from the Lieutenant General earlier. And in response to that, one of the key UK priorities to date has been leadership in space sustainability and space safety. Now, I should caveat that. Obviously, earlier this year, we had the election of a new government, and we're currently evaluating the priorities in terms of what we look into and what we prioritize in space. But there is recognition that preserving the space environment is important to future commercial opportunities in space. Now, the work to date in leadership in space sustainability and space safety has really been across in the UK, across three key pillars. And these three key pillars have been chosen to try and address the trends that we've heard about previously. So the first pillar has been developing missions and capabilities. One of those that I'd like to highlight today is the establishment of our National Space Operations Centre, which is a joint civil defence initiative to provide capabilities, particularly to our commercial operators, to provide collision avoidance capabilities under a service known as Monitor Space Hazards. So that's really to then look towards preventing known collisions. The second pillar has been supporting developing new technologies, so enabling technologies, and as principally within the Space Agency, been looking at active debris removal, so supporting the technologies that will provide the capabilities to remediate the environment in the future. And the third pillar has been regulatory policy. One area of that has been the establishment of our civil spaceflight regulator under the CAA, and so they license orbital and launch activities within the UK. Now, one of the areas that I'm actually heavily involved in is in the multilateral activities. So I'm a member, I lead the UK delegation at the IADC. And the IADC, for those who aren't aware, is the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. And it's a group of 13 space agencies, of which NASA and JAXA and CNES and ourselves are a member. And we work together to develop, to do joint research on debris-related activities. And on the back of that, we develop guidelines that I hope a lot of you are familiar with on space debris mitigation. Now, one of our recent products, and it's an annual release now, is the status on the space debris environment. And this is really to give an insight into the current status of the environment, so the compliance to the space debris mitigation guidelines, but then also looking at the environmental evolution. So where is the environment going? So we've noticed that the trends that Audrey mentioned, but how is the environment evolving? and where can we see what is a sustainable environment. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, to access the report. It's released annually. And this is the way that the IADC is trying to understand what that future sustainable or acceptable environment might look like, and the metrics that might be needed.
I think as we go through the talk here, we're going to get a little deeper into those metrics and how we might use them. I'm going to turn now to Eric for the operator's perspective. So given the situation that Audrey and Andrew have talked about, obviously SpaceX is a very key driver in that change in the environment right now. I think, how many Starlings are there operating now? Oh, it's over 6,000, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you build that operational experience from flying that large constellation, you guys are doing this, you're seeing this environment change in real time. What are the key needs that you're seeing from the SSA ecosystem here in order to support sustainable operations of that constellation?
Yeah, so thanks for the invite. Thanks for the good question. I think I'll start by saying the most sustainable place to fly in LEO is probably below about 600 kilometers, or even VLEO, since obviously the higher atmospheric density will passively and quickly clear up any debris. And that's why Starlink flies lower than any of the broadband mega constellations. But I think what we need from the space surveillance environment is actually quite simple, and it is to minimize latency. Today's industry standard latency, meaning time from observation of an object to association of that object in the catalog to updated orbit determination, screening, and finally issuance of the CDM takes hours. Generously, let's call it 8 hours. It's 2024. Why are we measuring that in hours and not minutes or even seconds? And then on the operator side, I think it's actually quite uncommon to find an operator who will actually take action on a CDM with less than a day or two time until closest approach. And this is real. I mean, some operators only staff their manual collision avoidance process during business hours, and orbits don't pause and wait for you to come back to your desk. So there's this issue of latency. And the point is a lot can change in LEO in 24 hours. For example, recently we experienced the G5 geomagnetic storm on May 10th. From the Starlink side, what we saw was more than a 10x increase in peak local densities relative to the mean at a more quiescent baseline. Now, 10x is a tremendous amount for your number one disturbance to your propagation to change. And for that to happen in a collision avoidance process which has more than 24 hours of latency, well, it just means your collision avoidance process isn't going to work during that period of time. And there's more to this than neutral density dynamics as well. If you think about early mission cataloging or cataloging following breakup, collision, ASAT, explosion type events, where there's this immediate release of a bunch of new objects, those are also circumstances in which it takes days or more often weeks to fully catalog the objects created from that event. So again, minimizing latency can go a long way. And perhaps the thing I'm most afraid of is an increasing population of uncooperative maneuverable vehicles. So for an uncooperative maneuverable vehicle, if they execute what is just a routine station-keeping maneuver, and you integrate the effect of that maneuver across 24 hours, you can very easily pick up tens of kilometers of positional uncertainty, again, rendering a 24-hour or more collision avoidance process completely ineffective. This is a problem, and for reference, Starlink satellites perform these routine, the majority of Starlink satellites perform these routine station-keeping maneuvers at least once per day. Many often perform them more than once per day. And so if, say, a large system of uncooperative maneuverable vehicles were to deploy and were to come to the same logical, technical, operational approach that I think Starlink has come to, collision avoidance processes that have more than 24 hours, that require more than 24 hours between the observation and the time of closest approach will not work. Full stop. And so barring any diplomatic or international regulatory developments, the only thing that we can do as the SSA community and as operators is to minimize latency. This is why on Starlink, our satellites can autonomously maneuver with only about an orbit's notice. This is why on Starlink we developed a low latency screening service that we invite other operators to participate in that'll screen trajectories on the minute level rather than on the hours level, and that facilitates machine-to-machine autonomous maneuver responsibility coordination. The system is available on our website. The link is, we need a better link for it, docs.space-safety.starlink.com. Find me later, I'll tell you about it. And we are working with the Office of Space Commerce to deploy this system to tracks since we believe so strongly that the industry needs to move to a lower latency approach. And the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry if I've gone over time, is that if you really think about what it takes to minimize latency, it means exchanging data at the observation level, not at the fused OD level. The number one thing I think the SSA community can do to improve the safety of LEO and help everyone fully realize LEO's potential is to build an observation economy in which we're sharing observations from multiple different networks, fusing them into global OD solutions such that that fused OD solution will have the fastest possible convergence time back onto target, whether it's an uncooperative maneuverable, whether it's a geomagnetic storm, whether it is a debris breakup event. This is the number one thing that I think the SSA community can do to improve safety.
Eric, thank you for that. I'm hearing both a tool that we need to work on and a challenge to the audience here. So I think maybe we can get back to some of the finer points on that as we go here. I want to now turn to Richard and Andrea. I'm going to ask you the same question to both of you, and then to Richard first, and then have Andrea follow. Listening to the situation described by our previous three speakers here, how do you approach defining and measuring the space environment capacity in your own current work, and how does it respond to the situation that we've described? So, Richard?
Yep. So at MIT, my research group focuses on studying orbital capacity. We really have two approaches for defining it. The first approach we've coined and basically describe as intrinsic capacity, and that's in the case where you know where everything is. There's no uncertainty, and this is a scenario where you're just trying to pack orbits. Intrinsic capacity has a lot of really interesting astrodynamical problems that you could solve, and we've studied that for about 5 years now, and I think we have really good solutions for intrinsic capacity. But the real limiter for capacity is what we call risk-based capacity. In the risk-based calculation, there are a lot of quantities that we don't know very well. So, for example, you might not know the lethal non-trackable population. You might not know the positions of all the orbital debris exactly. And what we do is we take into account all that information in a probabilistic calculation. For risk-based capacity, other folks have worked on that. There's various approaches for calculating these risk-based quantities. One approach is using a source sink model. A source sink model is, in the folks in the audience, if you remember, during COVID, we had these epidemiological models that can simulate infected, diseased, and recovered individuals. And those models simulate those individuals looking at the populations. A source sink model works in the same way. So we look at different populations in the space environment, orbital debris, active payloads, and rocket bodies, for example. You can have as many species as you'd like. And the benefit of a source sink model is that it's fast. It's a population-based model, it's quick, and you model like it sounds, the sources and sinks of those different species. We also have something that's called the Monte Carlo model. The Monte Carlo model is seen as, in the community, the research community, as the gold standard. You mentioned IADC working group. When folks from that working group discuss different options and studies, they're usually doing this with a Monte Carlo model. These are very computationally expensive. They can require supercomputing resources. Maybe think on the order of 600 cores to run these models. And so we have this tool called MoCat. And one of the initiatives that we started with MoCat is how do we make all these calculations transparent? The source sink model, the Monte Carlo model, and make it in a way that we can forward the research. If it's transparent, folks can question some of the assumptions, and we can move forward and come to a common understanding when it comes to orbital capacity. If you're interested in some of these calculations and you want to look into it more, just Google MIT MoCat. MoCat stands for the MIT Orbital Capacity Assessment Tool. And you'll find our GitHub link. You can download the tools and run them yourself. Now, once you have these models that can simulate the environment, capacity, how you measure capacity can be done in various ways. And in a sense, that measure of capacity is sort of a value judgment. What are you trying to maintain? What do you mean by sustainability? The approach that we've taken for capacity is we want to ensure that the environment can operate in a steady state state, where if we're choosing a certain level of capacity, there is a steady state solution that environment can operate in. And we do that by looking for equilibriums in the environment. And the environment doesn't necessarily need to operate at that equilibrium, but our calculations just show that that particular environment is not either decreasing fairly rapidly and leading to a cascade event. And so we define capacity in this way, and we do this in a shell-wise computation. So we can compute capacity as a function of altitude. Now, that's just a calculation. There's a lot of assumptions that go into it, and this is something that we've said in the literature. Just going with a single number is also not a responsible approach to this, because that number needs to be caveated with what are you assuming in terms of collision avoidance efficacy? And like Eric mentioned earlier, that's a really tricky question, right? If there's tons of latencies, and are you assuming that 99.9% of collisions are avoided? Might not be a great assumption. What are we assuming in terms of post-mission disposal and things like that? What's the initial population? What data are you using to model that initial population? So I think all of these questions have to be answered, and you're going to ask this question later on. I think that's the direction that we could take maturing these tools in.
Preview of the discussion to come. Andrea?
So hi. Yes, in our models, so in my group that is collaborating with the European Space Agency, we use some of the tools that are already been mentioned by Richard. So in our model, we use some risk-based metrics where we account for the probability of some fragmentation events that could be either collisions or explosion. And then we investigate which is the severity of those fragmentations. So the clouds generated by the fragmentation of our satellite, how will it interact with the population of both the active objects but also not active objects that are already orbiting around the Earth. So we want to compute like the cumulative collision probabilities that our clouds will have with these objects. What we do is to compute this metric along the entire lifetime of the mission of our object, so we can define like different phases of our mission, the launch phase, the operational phase, and also the post-mission disposal phase. So we can account for the impact of each phase of the mission, and then we can aggregate the results and have the impact of the entire mission on the space environment. So in this way, we have the impact of the single mission on the space environment, and then from our approach, we aggregate the results of all the missions, not only of the active spacecraft, but also we can account for rocket bodies or non-operational spacecraft. And with this aggregation, we define the capacity consumed by the population that is now orbiting around the Earth or the set that we are investigating. Then we can define, as already mentioned, some like threshold for the space capacity. To do so, what we do is we use some evolutionary model from which we can predict which would be the environment in some years. So like, for example, 50 to 100, 100 years in the future. And we can define what is, in our mind, the behavior that the space environment should like fit to be sustainable in a long-term point of view. And And then we can compute this capacity on this evolution and define it as a threshold. When we have these thresholds, then we can see, okay, how many launch we can have per year, but not only in terms of number of spacecraft, but also the location of the spacecraft, because depending on, for example, the orbit altitude or orbit inclination, our risk metric will give different results to the same spacecraft. Because, of course, there are regions that are crowded, regions that are more free of space, but also where fragmentation will interact less with the orbiting objects. So our capacity approach will take into account also these different, let's say, point of view. Our model was originally defined for the low Earth orbit region, but now we have extended within a project with the European Space Agency to other orbital regions. So we are able to use this model also in the medium Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, but also in the geostationary transfer orbit. And we are also thinking of extending to like cross of the orbits between one type of orbits and the other. So this is how we are dealing with it now.
All right, thank you both, Richard and Andrea. And when we get to this next round, we're going to get a little bit deeper into how data from this community, data from operators might help you build those out. I'm going to come back around. I'm going to come to Andy here. So we've heard about threshold capabilities, capacity thresholds that are being worked on in the research community. We've heard about some of the operator needs. Policy forum here. Let's talk about what this might or might not mean for a regulatory system or for policy systems. Where does engagement with regulators like the CAA that you mentioned, governance forums like COPUOS, where does engagement with these entities stand on this issue? And is the IADC, has played a central role in establishing practice for debris mitigation? Do we need a similar function for establishing a central look at thresholds?
Thanks, Ian. So that's quite a broad question, so I'll do my best to give you some insight. So in terms of the multilateral forums, the key place that sustainability is discussed at the moment is within COPUOS, so the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and its two associated subcommittees, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, where I'm the head of UK delegation on, and then also the Legal Subcommittee. Within COPUOS, it's over 100 member states who meet throughout the year to identify collaborative opportunities for future research and also tackle regulatory challenges. And one of those which has been recognized is long-term sustainability or the outer space environment. And so over a number of years, there's been a working group on LTS, so the long-term sustainability, which is sought to develop guidelines on sustainability and practices for operators and regulators on how they can encourage sustainability and sustainable activities in space. Now, one of the major products of that has been 21 agreed guidelines. So these are guidelines which look across regulatory frameworks, across safety of space operations, across research development, and across capacity building. I would say within those forums, one of the areas that the UK is focused on is on the implementation of the guidelines to try and get that commonality in terms of approach, in terms of the regulatory environment. So sharing how our regulator in the UK, the CAA, the spaceflight regulator, operate, what they do in terms of authorization and supervision of missions in the UK, to try and encourage those practices around sustainability. I noted earlier in terms of the point on needs around diplomatic and regulatory channels, and this has been one of the areas that we've tried to work on to try and encourage operators, particularly from emerging space nations, through capacity building efforts to share space situational awareness activities. But in terms of coming to the topic of this discussion on metrics and sustainability and modeling, we've not yet got to that stage. So to try and fill the gap and to try and support some of the thinking within the UK, we recently kicked off quite a short study called the Space Environment Sustainability Assessment Study. And the key part of this is first to look at the metrics. So we heard about the type of models that are being developed. So within the UK, we're trying to look at what does a metric need to look like? How can we set these thresholds? But also look a bit more broader in terms of the other indicators that may need to be incorporated into those models. So not necessarily just on the physical environment, but looking at the socio and economic conditions that would inform a metric moving forward. The second part of the study is then looking at the regulatory fit. So once we've developed those models, how would a regulator moving forward incorporate that into their regulatory system? At one end, you can have essentially it as a rating to understand the sustainability of emission. But on the other side, it could act to coordinate how regulators act and how they encourage or not launch or use of certain orbits moving forward. And then the last part is then looking at technology. So once we have these models and we understand what the environment looks like and where we want to drive the environment, what are the technologies that are needed then, or the behaviors that are needed to then reach those targets in terms of sustainable environment? So we're performing this study at the moment, and we're hoping to produce some results by early next year. And hopefully that will inform our approach to using these models moving forward.
Keep losing the microphone here. That's not great. All right. Thank you, Andy. So I'm going to now turn to Audrey, and I actually want to pivot off of something that Eric challenged us already with. So Audrey, Slingshot is a member of a group known as the SSA Commercial Coalition. I'm going to ask you, what tools and capabilities does the commercial SSA sector bring to bear in supporting large constellation operators addressing this complex environment? Can you deliver on the latency challenge that Eric offered?
Thanks so much, Ian. And first, let me just say a little bit about the SSA Coalition, which is a group of U.S. space situational awareness or space domain awareness companies who have banded together to advocate for greater adoption of commercial SSA data, software, analytics for use by both governments as well as commercial owner-operators. And I think our capabilities are quite mature. I mean, if you look across the board in terms of our ability to detect and track objects with multiple phenomenologies, our ability to do orbit determination, generate ephemerides, and to perform the kinds of conjunction assessment screenings. I mean, I don't have a precise technical answer to Eric's challenge about the latencies, but I will just provide actually two recent examples. I'm sure everyone in this crowd is aware that we had two significant upper stage breakups just in the last 2 months. You had the G60 launch, the first launch of China's new mega constellation, which the upper stage broke up shortly after the deployment of the payloads. And then a few weeks later, we had the breakup of a Centaur upper stage. And in both cases, Slingshot Aerospace was the first entity, government or commercial, to actually publicly report on these events. We shared two-line element sets from the G60 launch in the interest of spaceflight safety to make sure that owner-operators could use those in their conjunction assessments, because it was, I think, another almost 24 hours or so before U.S. Space Command published information on SpaceTrack. And similarly with the Centaur launch, I think it was actually a couple of days. Now, I'm not here to create a competition between the private sector and the government capabilities. This isn't about who's better or who's faster. It's actually really to say that commercial has capabilities that can be utilized by the space industry. And in fact, in the case of the military mission, we can support the ability of the military to focus its resources on the really hard protect and defend challenges while we take care of the basic spaceflight safety, monitoring, and traffic management so that we can use our most exquisite space domain awareness resources for the toughest challenges. Now, also, on the topic of tools, of course, in addition to the tools that we as SSA providers have, Eric talked about the tools that are available for owner-operators to use in their own operations to support their conjunction assessments and their collision avoidance planning. And so when I look at this challenge of growing capacity and just the need to do better to manage the space environment, I don't see a lack of tools. What I see is a lack of adoption of the tools. the place where we need to work is on the system of rules and requirements to use those tools and the guidance and thresholds for what actions to take when incidents arise. And unfortunately, in a prior life, I spent many years actually representing the US government in some of the diplomatic forums that Andy just talked about in his answer. And as great as the work that has been done in some of the international bodies, it is quite slow. And it is really not keeping pace with this exponentially evolving space environment that we see before us today.
Thank you for that, Audrey. I'm going to call an audible here in the planned questions. I want to actually turn real quick because you said something I want to get a reaction to. So you said one of our questions in this panel is, do we need more tools to manage the environment in a more holistic way? You just said we don't need more tools, we need more adoption. Eric, Andy, I want to see if you have a reaction to that. Do you agree with that? Is it adoption the issue, or is there a need for more tools? Sorry, I just want to kind of get a quick reaction. So, yeah.
Well, one of my criticisms with the current regulatory process is that it's whatever regulations that there are unevenly applied. This is true. Some operators are legally required to perform physical coordination, and others are not. If we were encountering a new vehicle and I wanted to know if the other operator was legally required, I'd have to call up, my good friend David Goldman to look up their license from the FCC. He'd read through it and tell me whether or not they're legally required to. Now, in practice, we don't do that. We're happy to take maneuver responsibility for pretty much any conjunction. But the point is, yes, I think I agree with the issue being a lack of enforcement out of some core safety principles, such as share your planned burns, make sure your ephemeris quality is good, have a high contact frequency such that when circumstances change, you can quickly let everybody else know what's going on, support collision avoidance operations for the entirety of the satellite's operation. The activation and disposal parts of a satellite's life, hopefully you measure that in hours such that 99% of the satellite's life it can perform evasive maneuvers. These are some of the things that I think we should see broader adoption of, probably increased regulation, and definitely evenly applied across all actors. If the counter is going to be, well, that's going to make it economically unfeasible for other people to get off the ground, I think my counter would go something along the lines of, well, every car needs headlights, taillights, and turn signals, regardless of how many are going to be produced. I think the same should be true of satellites.
Thank you. Real quick, Andy.
Yeah, just briefly respond to that in terms of lack of tools. I think there's different components, and I think picking up on the regulatory point. So in terms of national regulatory frameworks globally, they're made up of international obligations through things where they've ratified the Outer Space Treaty, but then also recognition of non-binding guidelines. And those non-binding ones are then only really incorporated through national regulations. So the consistency of those national regulations is one of the key aspects to ensure that one regulator expectations is similar to another, and that's why we work. We do a lot of work bilaterally, but also multilaterally within COPIUS to share those practices, to share how what our expectations are and what that achieves in terms of safety of the space environment. And that can really only be done through discussion and sharing those best practices. I think just coming to the topic of lack of tools and specifically on the sustainability point, there is, as we've heard, a lot of modeling activity that's being performed internationally. but there's no agreed model, metric, threshold, even understanding of what a sustainable environment looks like and what are the conditions that are associated with that. So I think that the key part on and on the topic of this panel is to have that discussion at an international forum to understand where we're headed and what would a good and an acceptable space environment look like.
All right. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry for that little bit diversion from the plan, Richard and Andrea, but I did want to kind of topically jump in on that. So, Richard, coming back to you, and so getting a little bit deeper into the metrics and how we mature the models that you and Andrea and others are working on to make them potentially operationally relevant or policy relevant. What do you need to do that, and what capabilities can folks assembled here provide you?
Yeah, so I think one of the inputs to our models is, something that operators can help with. For example, post-mission disposal. If we have more reliable estimates on how we intend to dispose of our satellites on orbit, I think that's going to improve the predictions of the model. Like was mentioned earlier, collision avoidance efficacy. So like, if we're assuming in our model that these collisions avoidance maneuvers are happening, that's going to affect the output. And then there's some other things that we found in our findings of certain things that operators could do to improve space sustainability. So we wrote a paper on stacking orbital shells and how you can stack orbital shells fairly efficiently. And one of the findings is, which is common practice amongst a lot of operators, is to use frozen orbits. And if you use frozen orbits, you can minimize the altitude variation in your constellation, thereby reducing potential overlap and collision avoidance. And there's a lot of folks that are doing that. But it's not clear which constellations are doing that. And so one of the things when you use these tools that you have to do is, one, give the tools input conditions, but also try to forecast what the future is going to look like. And for us, it's a little bit of a guessing game. And I think as a community, we can decide, how are things going to evolve in the future.
So there's another argument for increasing transparency in on their operator-provided data
definitely.
and maneuver plans. Yep. So, Andrea, kind of a similar question for you. What are the next steps for the TEMIS model that you described, and how are you engaging with satellite operators?
So basically, in September, we just started the new phases of the project, where we are looking to the entire formulation and see what can be improved, which are the uncertainties, and so how we can refine our model. However, as said, we have plenty of model, but if we only have model and we improve them, they stay there. So the operator should start to use them, be familiar with them. So in the slides that I think you can show now.
Show the image.
Basically, we want to involve the operator in this next phase of the project. So we want some of the operator to be tester of our software. That will be soon also released as a web user interface open to all the operators and all the people that are interested in. So if anybody is interested, you can scan the code and compile the form, and you will be contacted in case we can then continue to have this collaboration, because we really need the feedback of the operators in okay, the models are fine, this is missing, this is can be improved, we have this type of data, so we really need the operators to be involved in the development of the tools, because we can put the models, we can refine the models, but then they have to be used by the operators. So we also need their point of view and their information to properly improve the model.
All right, thank you. So yeah, opportunity there to directly engage, and Andrea, I'm sure you're around for the next 3 days if folks want to chat. All right, looking at the big red clock, going down to about 17 minutes here, but Eric, I've got one more. I want to come to you, and then we're going to get the audience questions into this here. So what role do you as an operator, if any, see for these thresholds approach being discussed in this panel? Can capacity models or threshold models, for instance, be used to help large constellations like Starlink deploy while maintaining access for future uses?
Today, I'd say we largely reject them, actually. I think there's plenty of space for other operators today, and there will continue to be in the future. What we need, I think, are clearer, evenly applied, enforceable policies on how to operate safely in space. this is essential to fully unlocking the full capability of LEO for everyone. And I think some of the key requirements there are maneuverability, a certain amount of agility, as in responsiveness to CDMs, high quality ephemeris generation. Just imagine a world in which many satellites had high frequency contact, maintained, well-defined, tightly maintained a well-defined station keeping box, et cetera. You could pack a lot of satellites into LEO, and I think you could do so responsibly, especially if the space surveillance side of things is also operating at low latency. So overall, I think the capacity assessments as a regulatory framework is putting the cart before the horse. There's so much to do about the fundamentals that I don't think regulation targeted at capacity is the right place to start.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm actually going to pick up on that because I think that's a good thing to kind of discuss here. And there's an audience question here that says, oh, where did it go? Getting too many in. The audience question says essentially, why are we having this discussion when there is no political or regulatory will to put hard numbers in around particular shells, particular regimes? I would say that's not necessarily the way that we would want to use these models. Various different reasons saying n number of objects in a particular orbit doesn't make sense for technology that, as Eric described, for some of the uncertainties, Richard, that you described. So step back, Eric, if you say we don't want to use these as a regulatory tool for capacity, okay, maybe we can accept that. What other ways might we use these sort of models in a policy system? For instance, how can they help regulators or policymakers get to that consistency, Eric, that you're looking for across jurisdictions? So I think, Andy, this question may be for you, and then I think for Richard as well. So and then I'll phrase it more specifically, if the use case is not setting an N, it's not setting a limit, what other potential ways can these tools be policy relevant?
Yeah. So that decision is really kind of not up to me. My job is to really define the physics, and I think the way that we calculate things, it's really focused on the astrodynamics, the physics, the statistics, and there are some inputs that go into it, but at the end of the day, it's a value judgment, right? So like how you define. So for example, I'll give you an example. So one of the calculations that we can do with some of our tools is calculate a maximum capacity as a function of altitude. So the way it works with the source sync models is you look for an equilibrium solution that maximizes the amount of satellites you can fit at that altitude. But it turns out that the capacity is not a single number. It's a capacity risk manifold. So if you're willing to accept a lot of risks, meaning a lot of collision risks, you can fit as many satellites as you like in low Earth orbit. Now, if you want to go with low collision risk, let's say like below 1%, the number is a lot less. And it's not a uniform number as a function of altitude, right? If you go lower in altitudes, you can fit a lot more satellites because atmospheric drag is going to cleanse the orbit. A lot of this is just physics, right? So that's kind of what we do at MIT. And then, how that physics is used and how we assign that value as a society to orbits, that's not really our place. Our place is really to be really good at modeling the physics and give policymakers decisions. And then they can make a value judgment. Does it make sense for us to operate satellites in this way? And what are the results of these different policies that we're enacting?
So outside a direct regulatory use, I think there's probably three key areas where these tools would be useful. I think the first is in raising awareness. So we heard the figures that Audrey mentioned earlier. The environment is changing, and so we need to understand where it's evolving and where it's going, and essentially use that and build upon lessons learned from other environmental challenges that we've seen to understand whether we can be a step ahead of any future challenges. The second area is setting behaviors. So we've seen within Europe ESA's zero debris policy, and they use models to inform what those new requirements for the ESA missions should look like. Again, trying to preempt where the environment is heading and set behaviors now that will mean that they are limiting their impact on the environment moving forward. And then thirdly, it's also targeting technology development. So if we identify, if we use these models to identify the technologies that might be needed in future, whether it is better capabilities from SSA services, whether it's deorbit systems, tracking systems, a range of different capabilities, these models and these tools can be used to inform that targeted technology development. And within government spends, it's obviously, it's not an infinite pot, particularly in the UK. And so we need to have those targeted mechanisms to understand where we should fund specific technologies.
Hey, Ian, can I jump in on this a little bit with a little more of a, I don't know, sort of a theoretical or just a sort of a general answer to the question. You know, in the world of establishing policies and regulation, there's kind of a life cycle that begins with basic research, transitions into operational practice, and ends with policy and regulation. And that's actually the best way that it can work, because the last thing you want is for a bunch of policymakers who really don't understand the technical aspects of it to be making policies on things that are really not well understood or not put into operational practice. And so even if this discussion on carrying capacity is maybe 50 or 100 years out in terms of actual implementation in policy or regulation, I think it's still important that we do research not only into the carrying capacity, but into all of the other ways that we can manage our space environment more effectively, whether that is improved space domain awareness tools, improved operational tools, because we've got to get that foundational layer so that owner-operators, so that space domain awareness providers can put those things into practice. We can have experience with them in the real world before policymakers and regulators actually cement those or crystallize them into law and policy.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the important thing that's coming out in all these comments is that regulation and policy are different things, right? And so we may jump to regulation as where the mind wants to go, but these tools may have a lot more use in a policy context that Eric doesn't immediately put any kind of direct regulatory burden on you all as operators, right? And so I think that exploring that kind of distinction is important. So we have way more questions than we're possibly going to get to in the 8 or 9 minutes I have remaining. So as a moderator, I do apologize for that, but we've got people up on stage that are giving us things to think about. So I'm going to try and move through some of these fairly smartly if we can. So a question from Brian Whedon, I'm going to just adjust very slightly. What guidance does the academic community, so this is for Andrea and for Richard, what guidance do you need from us in the policy realm about further adjustments to the models for thresholds or for capacity?
So basically, as said, I mean, in the academia, we focus on the, let's say, in the research and on the models, but then these models can be used as tool then to define policies, regulations. So what we can give to the policy part and regulations are the results and also this study that can be also like be in line with what the policy asks. So maybe we want to understand the impact of the post-mission disposal on the missions. So if we have to define some threshold in terms of like the 25-year rules, 5 years, 1 year, so we can have like this interaction with the operators and also who are making policies, so that we have what they need and we can exploit our models to then properly define these regulations.
Yeah, so I piggyback on that question. I think that answer was really good. From our perspective, is what levers do policymakers intend to use and have access to? And so what we can do from the modeling side is really get an assessment of like the effect of that. There's certain things that are going to give you more bang for your buck. And I have a project with NASA out of the Office of Technology and Policy that we're looking at, and we're looking at policy interventions and which policy interventions result in the best effect on space sustainability. So from a policymaker, the things that we don't see from an academic community, what are the levers that policymakers have, and then we can study those from a technical standpoint.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to try and combine a few things that are coming through here in the questions. We have a couple of questions from the audience about the role of circular space economy concepts and moving away from treating assets as disposable. Essentially, we have questions about do we need to increase increase active debris removal as a way of increasing capacity in the system. Note that multiple approaches and multiple solutions are going to be needed to all of this. I think the question I want to phrase out of this is, do the tools that Andrea, Richard, you guys, Andrea are working on, do capacity models, threshold models, would they help us to understand how some of these other aspects of the system might be useful?
I'll take a 30-second response to that. Yes. So one of the things that's really clear, you go higher in altitude, it has a larger effect on space sustainability. You can counteract that effect with active debris removal. So it's a good question, and sort of circular economy, the technology behind that, I think that's up for operators, folks that are building satellites to decide, can I build a satellite that's reusable in that way? But absolutely. I think as an output of some of the tools and the simulations we do, we see that you go higher in altitude, you can have drastic effects. So anything above 1,000 kilometers is really pushing it in terms of space sustainability.
Yeah, so Eric, you said 600, right? Was the point that you used? Yeah.
Yeah. Next year I'll say 500.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll have you back and hold you to that.
Ian, just on the circular economy, I think picking up to what Audrey said earlier in terms of having that basic research. Prime's developing satellites. It will take a long time for them to adopt refueling ports, adopt modularity within their spacecraft, the risk adverse in terms of the design and development of their spacecraft. But recognizing that there may be benefits to the environment by adopting those technologies is another incentive for them to start incorporating those technologies now. So they're in 5 years, in 10 years, when they need them and when they can access them because the commercial market's there to sustain them. That's when we can reach the circular economy, and that's when we can derive the benefits both for the environment and potentially also commercially.
Yeah. Okay, kind of a quick couple of sets here. So there's a question about whether space weather is considered and atmospheric density is considered in the work that is being done by in the modeling. So that's for Andrea.
So let's say that in some way yes, in some way no, in the sense that we are trying to improve our models and trying to account as many, let's say, uncertainties that we can, but then at some point we need also to stop because of computational cost. So we are trying to start from simple models and then improve them as soon as we can, also improving the speed of our computation, because one of the bottlenecks of these models are, of course, the computational cost. So we also need to take into account that. So we are trying to, let's say, include all this stuff, but one step at a time.
I'll just 10 seconds on that. So we have a really interesting result coming out. What we're looking at is, it turns out that climate change is affecting the thermosphere, and it's causing a contraction effect. So this is really long-term space weather. And so we've been studying how that can affect the carrying capacity in low Earth orbit. It makes sense to put things lower, but if the atmosphere compresses, it's really going to compress activity. And it's going to make all of these notions of cooperation, collision avoidance, real time, that Eric mentioned earlier, that much more important.
So just a brief plug, our policy forum on Friday is about space weather and SSA, so we probably won't get at that level, but do, for more discussion of those interplays, come here on Friday. This next one is for, I think, Eric and for Audrey. A couple of questions here about uncertainty and differences in answers you get from different providers. So, Eric, the question is essentially, reducing latency is great, but how do we deal with all the uncertainties that we still have, even if the latency is better in CDMs or in collision assessment? And then Audrey, the question for you is similar, but it's many different collision avoidance solutions, private and public. How do we make sure that they're consistent between them?
Well,
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. When I think of uncertainty, the simple way that I try and think about it is distance is v times t plus 1/2 at squared. T shows up a lot in there, minimize t, and you're going to minimize the delta displacement. So if we have systems that can observe the relevant object, respond to that relevant object on the order of a few hours, you're really not propagating that much uncertainty forward, and so it becomes a problem mostly of what are the observational residuals, how well did the filter converge before that event, and so on. This is in no way me trying to dissuade efforts to improve atmospheric modeling. That is important too. We've got to understand that A term. But I just want to put an emphasis on the propagation time, since I think that is where there's a lot of bang for the buck available.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we already live in a world where there are multiple providers of SSA information, multiple providers of space traffic coordination, recommendations, and even if we do what Eric suggested earlier in the panel of fusing data at the observational level, different propagation models, the impacts of space weather on the propagation. I mean, I don't think we're going to ever get to a place where there is a single source of truth or a single right answer of where an object is going to be and what the conjunction risk is with other objects. And so what we have to figure out is how we deal with that. And I really like the analogy to weather, where there's a European model for weather, there's an American model for weather, and that's why when you look at your phone, you get different forecasts depending on which model is being used. Now, in the weather situation, I mean, the analogy sort of breaks down, but there are people who have to make decisions on, evacuations in hurricane paths, for example, and there isn't a single source of truth that they use when making those decisions. And we've got to think about what that looks like in space, where we have different models and different answers, and how we compare those models and how we communicate those results to the potentially affected parties so that we can make the best informed decision that we can about how to avoid an incident in space.
All right. So I'm seeing a big blinking red light, which means I think we're standing between all of these people and coffee at this point. So I think I want to leave it there. I think, Audrey, that's a good place to kind of challenge us to go forward. But I think what I've heard through this is that, yes, we do need more approaches to managing the space environment, but it's not going to be a single tool to rule them all. It's going to be things, Eric, like you're talking about, very operationally focused. Let's get that latency down. Let's figure out how to have more transparency in what operators are sharing in terms of ephemeris and positional data, and let's drive to that consistency as much as we can across different jurisdictions. Richard, Andy, Andrea, right? It's, what is this as a policy tool in helping governments make informed decisions, not necessarily regulatory? And then, yeah, Audrey, what you just ended with there. So I want to thank the 5 panelists who gave their time this morning. Thank you all for the questions, and sorry we didn't get to them all.